All right, everyone, welcome. Today is January the 20th. This is the first Budget and Finance Committee meeting of the year. Welcome everybody back. We have a brief but important agenda today. We'll start off with approval of the November 4th, 2025 meeting minutes, if board members have had a chance to review the minutes.
So moved.
We have a motion from Chair Swanson to approve the minutes. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a second from Ms. Gordon. All in favor of approving the November 4th, 2025 meeting minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. So with that, we have a brief recap of the December 2025 budget presentation that you all heard at our retreat. Mr. Nieder, it's been a couple weeks since then, and as you know, the budget situation is very fluid and tends to evolve. So I understand you will update us on recent developments, and then we'll move into a small group exercise, dividing the committee up into different groups. All right, so whenever you're ready.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mr. Haggerty. Again, today we want to give you a very brief recap of what was presented to you back at your retreat in December. I want to share with you just a handful of slides that were in a presentation that was released just last week by the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. I think those would be very timely. And then, as you just shared, the board will work on a couple different exercises in small groups. And then finally, we'll review the budget development timeline for the 2026-2027 operating budget for the district. Before we continue that, I want to, maybe just take a quick step back and provide some context. As I think about the district's operating budget, it's large, but that too can be put into context, and maybe it's not so large. It is very complex based upon a number of different funding sources and a myriad of other accounting codes. And sometimes looking at it can be a bit daunting, and maybe more than a bit daunting. But at the end of the day, the operating budget is really nothing more than a pool of resources that can be used to carry out the work of our organization. Nothing more. And that work our organization carries out is guided by the district's strategic plan. The strategic plan sets our vision and mission. It establishes our core beliefs. It identifies priorities. It sets aims and goals. And a way to think about it is the strategic plan is the roadmap, and the budget is what is used to put gas in the tank to follow the roadmap, with the understanding that the budget is finite in amount and we don't want to run out of gas. So with that little bit of context, I'm going to jump right in. We are in an increasingly uncertain funding environment, one I've not seen in 20 years. And in my 20 years of private sector experience, one I've not seen there either. The temporary COVID pandemic relief funds are behind us in the rearview mirror. Federal activity is affecting key aspects of our operation. Things that are or are not happening at the state level are similarly putting constraints and uncertainty in our near-term future. And inflation is continuing to drive up costs of health insurance, property insurance, utility rates, transportation, our food costs for child nutrition program, classroom supplies, etc. So the demand for funds continues, and yet we still have, you can see on the slide, a lot of challenges in front of us in conducting our core business. At the local level, and local funding makes up a little over a third of our operating budget, most of that being the county appropriation. Wake County's revenue forecasts are looking at about 2% annually for the next few years. And that is down from what it has been. And overall, their natural revenue growth, and this is for the county, not for Wake County Schools, but for all of the county's needs, for next year is in the $40 to $50 million range. And Wake County must use that to fund any increased needs across the entire county. Wake County Public Schools is only one of those needs. And we have been fortunate in the recent past to receive significant $40, $50 million year-over-year increases for several years in a row, but we do not see that in our near term at this point. When we look at together federal and state funding, they represent a majority of the operating budget, just those two. And yet, those two categories have an incredible amount of uncertainty associated with them at this point. There's no clear indication of when information at either the federal or the state level will be available such that we can make reasonable projections. And making a reasonable projection, well, I'll let you read the last bullet. There's some other pressure points that we face as well. We reviewed these in December. The good news is our staff vacancy rates continue to decline, largely a result, I think, of continued improvements in our HR recruiting efforts, coupled with our capacity in recent years to get our salary structure into a more competitive place than it has been. So that's the good news along with the challenges. Lapsing salaries are no longer lapsing. The vacancies just are not there. Another pressure point is that funds that we have used, for example, unassigned fund balance or other funds that carry over to use funding gaps are shrinking. And we'll get into the unassigned fund balance on a slide in a few minutes. And then again, unassigned fund balance is one of those things as well. A few other pressure points, and you're familiar with this. Without revenue changes at this point, our CNS operations are kind of on the cusp of requiring operating budget funding to maintain its operations. And so there are a couple ways out of it. Increased meal prices, increased participation rates, but even that, because participation rates, when they go up, food costs go up, and labor costs actually will go up. So there's no free lunch there, and with some of the lowest per pupil funding of any district across the country, we are feeling a lot of pressure. There's no margin for error, if you will. And another pressure point I'll share with this group, it's difficult to make fiscal decisions that require giving something up. So I mentioned fund balance earlier, and I want to share this chart, and let me try to demystify it. That orange line that you see for the most part is on top of the black line. That represents our unassigned fund balance. And unassigned fund balance is one component of many different components of fund balance. Unassigned is only one. The unassigned component is not reserved for any other particular use, and it is available to the board to appropriate as needed for emergencies. It is also available to the board to appropriate into a future year's operating budget to balance the budget. And that's a practice the district has utilized for years, consistently. As you look at that growth and the timeline on the bottom at the far left, I think it's 2015, and at the far right, fiscal year 2024. So you'll see at the onset of the pandemic, a pretty steep growth and increase in the amount of unassigned fund balance. That was by design, and we were able to do that primarily because of the large influx of pandemic relief funds that we received. And we intentionally did not spend them all at the front end. We intentionally did that knowing there'd be a fiscal transition on the other side of those funds. And effectively, even though it only goes through fiscal year '24, you can see that orange coming down, and if we carried it out over the next 2 years, it would continue to come down. So that's the orange line, available for emergencies, available to appropriate into a future year's budget, although you have policy that says we should not use more than 50% of that to balance a future year's budget. The black line underneath it is the amount that in annual budgets has been appropriated into a budget to balance it. And again, you'll see that at the beginning of the pandemic start to go up significantly. And as it stands on this, at fiscal year '24, those two lines are about to cross. If it were to continue, you're going to see the orange line is going to keep coming down. And if you look at the verbiage on the right-hand side of the chart, it tells you the amounts of fund balance that we've had to appropriate to balance a budget. And in fiscal year '25, there was $32.4 million to balance it. The next year, $21.4 million. And based upon current projections, there'll be only $18.5 million to invest into next year's budget. So that in and of itself is putting pressure on the district, fiscal pressure. It's a revenue source that is shrinking. And so two things have to happen, or a combination. If that revenue is shrinking, we have to cut our expenditures or find another revenue source. So pulling together some of the outlook and landscape, we're anticipating that there will be legislative compensation changes for the 26-27 year. Some of that's based upon politics and that it is an election year. We had a similar assumption for the current year and proved to be incorrect. So our forecast there may be incorrect as well. I hope not. We know that every year when our teachers who have master's degree retire and we hire new teachers that might have a master's degree, the state no longer funds that, and so we have to have local funding to pay that 10% differential. The good news is it has helped us in recruiting, especially with our social workers, but other categories of teachers as well. But again, it's a required investment that requires additional funding year over year until we get to the point, if nothing changes, all of our master's teachers will be locally, the pay differential will be locally funded unless something has changed. We've got the challenge of if the charter percent of all students continues to go up, additional funds will have to flow through the charter schools. We'll be opening one new school next year, and that comes with operating costs. We've got other lease and other contractual obligations with escalations in them. And then any unfunded legislative mandates that we are required to meet, or for any loss of state or federal funding where we want to continue to maintain services, that will require some type of additional revenue that either comes from an increase in county appropriations or a reduction in our current budget. Want to do something, have to give something up. So, next few slides are something that the Department of Public Instruction, I believe, presented last week at the NC-ASBO, that stands for the North Carolina Association of School Business Officials. It's a group that we belong to, and I think probably every LEA in the state belongs to. And this is not the entire presentation, just a few slides. First slide is kind of in our face. We are now the only state in the country, according to DPI, without a budget for the current fiscal year. Not sure it's an accolade we want. This next chart, I'm going to spend a minute on, try to demystify this as well. But this is a chart at the state level about projected state revenues and projected state expenditures with the implications of the now legislated targeted tax rate, income tax rate reductions, corporate and personal, when the state hits certain overall revenue targets. We'll start with, and this, from the DPI slides, apparently they've got this flagged and attributed to the North Carolina Office of State Budget and Management as their source of information. And again, the far left slide is fiscal year 25, the year that ended back in June of 2025, and it goes all the way out to 2034. That blue line represents statewide the cost of all services the state has to provide or is currently providing. And it's my understanding is with inflation over time, they've carried that out over the years at current levels. So that's by current existing services. The orange line represents expected state revenues, including adjustments when income tax rates go down based upon the current legislation. So you'll see at the beginning of this chart, the orange line is above the blue line. Revenues are more than expenditures. And North Carolina, unlike the federal government, just like Wake County Schools, is required to have a balanced budget. North Carolina cannot issue debt like the federal government can to generate revenue to balance the budget. So the forecast that is on this slide shows just a couple years out that orange line intersecting the blue line and then going below it, which means there's not enough revenue to continue to provide the services pretty soon. And then that dotted green line has to do with the actual tax rate. But I think the key from this is, based upon the currently legislated tax structure and estimates from OSBM, a couple years out, something's going to have to give. And just like Wake County Schools, if the state wants to keep providing the services it has been, it's going to have to find the revenues. And its primary revenue source is tax. Or it's going to have to cut services, or some combination thereof. This is another slide that we already know about, but I just thought I would share again, reminding that with the exception of a moderate step increase that some of our teachers and other certified staff receive, there have been no compensation changes for any other staff across the state. Last two charts, and then we'll pull it together. This chart, and there were no notes, and we did not attend this presentation, but I'm assuming these are averages for public education funding broken down by federal, state, and local sources. And I think what I would like you to take away from this slide is just the shape of the lines. The very top line is state funding. And you see, and this runs from 2015 through fiscal year 2025. So you can see an increase over time, but then a flattening out of state funding on average. You can see in the orange line in the middle is local funding. You can see on average that had some growth over the time and then a tick up at the very end, last couple years. And then at the bottom is the federal funding. You can see relatively flat. You'll see an increase at the beginning of the pandemic and then a gradual reduction. But the takeaway for me is flattening of state funding, forcing across the state pressure on local governments to provide funding to backfill, if you will, or to even out. But again, I would look at this just as a general trend line and nothing more. And then the last chart we've got for you here, a little interesting. It's over time, and it goes from 2012 to 2025. Student to staff ratios. And so you see from 2012 up to just pre-pandemic, an increase of students to staff. And looking at that another way, there are fewer staff available to support our students over that period of time as time goes on. And then at the very beginning of the pandemic, you see a steep drop, likely a result of the capacity to hire additional staff, just as our district was able to do. So, using one example, behavioral health support position expansion. But then, after the beginning of the pandemic, a beginning of an erosion of that improvement and beginning to see fewer staff to support our students, just on average. And again, just for information. So with that, Mr. Haggerty, I don't know if you want to take any questions on that before the group breaks up into small groups, or if you want the groups to break up into small groups and do the exercise, do questions at the end.
So let's do this. Just, I don't know what everyone took away from the presentation. To me, it was pretty clear. You know, this is less about declining funds based on disenrollment from Wake County Public Schools. And it's much more about having increased cost per student while receiving less funding per student. All of those things that Mr. Nieder touched upon, insurance, utilities, salary costs, you know, those are rising. And it doesn't matter how many kids you have in the school, if the power keeps going up, right? If the insurance on the school keeps going up. You know, and reduced funding, if you see our student population increasing or holding steady, but those federal dollars coming in lower, state dollars flattening out, the county stepping in to fill the gap, you know, we're in a crunch. Is there anything specific to Mr. Nieder's charts that you heard that you have any questions about? Or if not, we'll go into the exercises and then report back to everyone at the close of the meeting. All right, well, Mr. Nieder, let's go into the exercises.
Okay, so the first, we'll just cover the first one and then come back, report out, and then we can review what the second exercise is. The first exercise is to ask each of the small groups to develop a list of all things that our district offers in terms of services, programs, schools, etc., that are beyond what is required by our constitutional mandates.
Now, do you, we still want to do 3 groups because this was originally for the
9.
retreat, and it was 9.
We can do 2 groups of 3.
Okay.
Move along a little quicker.
Okay.
And
Do
I
we
will
just
see-
divide it up in the room, or do we need to move anyone to another room?
I think that's your decision. I'm sure the boardroom is available if you wanted one group to move in there. And I will very quickly see if we've got some flip charts.
Okay. All right, we'll split up and then come back to report it. Okay? All right. All right, well, if we're ready, we will come back into session and do our report out, and then we will wrap up the meeting. All right. So, well, I know this was not a fun exercise for anyone. I appreciate all the time and thought people put in and the discussions that we're able to have in each of our groups. Really quickly, I thought we'd sort of report back out for each of the exercises. The first exercise, 1, was develop a list of all things that WCPSS offers in terms of services, programs, schools that are beyond what is required by law. And so I'll go ahead and just report out for Group 1. We had, a book full of information. Poor Miss Kimsey would need like a third arm to hold up, I think, everything we did. But we did try to categorize them into some categories. Things in terms of non-traditional school offerings, compensation, professional development, programs with our facilities that are not required by law, extracurricular activities, and then the list goes on. Things in technology, things in central services, things in terms of academic enrichment. And the thing is, so many of these things we identified all have real value and we believe have positive impacts on our students. But we tried to stay true to the exercise, which is if it wasn't required by law, it made our list. So that's what we had for exercise 1.
I'm not sure who in the group wants to volunteer to report out on the list.
I'll do it. So similar, but we had a lot of discussion and dialogue, so our list is not as extensive, but I think the theme is the same, that we understand that we do a lot because we're Wake County, and so while our list is not as extensive, again, the theme of we do a lot that is not statutorily required, not state mandated, and those things cost money and resources. So, and for the are you doing the second question yet?
Not yet.
Okay, sorry. So that's it.
Okay. So then if we can get the slide advanced to exercise 2. Then related to that, we heard about the myriad of challenges in front of the budget development process. So pick a specific budget challenge and discuss how we will work through it. So here we talked about 3 different budget challenges, the lack of state budget and possible, or I would go so far as to say expected federal reductions, and decided those were outside of the board's control. Where we might have some influence was locally, where we do have some influence working with our partners, the county commissioners, on local funds. However, here we know that county funds and the economic projections for the county look pretty grim as well. So our strategy was to identify any savings or areas for redistribution where money that comes in outside of state funds might be able to be repurposed for other needs that the district has. And so here we broke down to 3 categories. The one we talked about, I think, the most was technology, specifically looking at the budgets for device refresh and how extensively we need to maintain a 1-to-1 ratio of take-home devices. And here, even though it's a capital cost, where there's a reduction, it could lead to operational savings in terms of support for the technology for that many students, particularly students that might not even be at a higher reading level yet, but are taking home a Chromebook every night, even if it's at a grade where they don't have homework. We also looked at areas of school choice transportation. And while we have one of the best school choice programs in terms of our magnet programs and other offerings, it comes at a cost. And is there areas where, facing lack of funds, that might have to be scaled back? And then the third area that we saw was where we use local funds for professional development. Are there opportunities for partnership with other organizations? Has there been an investigation into the efficiency of what we do in-house versus what can be contracted out? Is one more cost-effective than the other? Can we save more by doing more in-house, or can we save more by doing more in partnership, outside? There are a lot of other individual things we thought that we could look at and re-examine, from paying the CDL costs for our bus driver applicants. But those three, technology, professional development, and the school choice transportation, were areas where we do invest local funds, where we thought we might be able to repurpose something.
We only had one on the
Yeah.
list, so you want to just roll with that one?
Sure.
So it was the,
So let me be clear, since we have ears and eyes, listening in and watching, it's not, necessary, it's all necessary. All the maintenance of our buildings is necessary, but we were specifically speaking of print, fresh paint, freshening up, landscaping, et cetera. If any savings could be found there. But I think, again, to the deeper dive and more extensive list that you all have, we had those similar items in conversation. We just didn't get them on the paper. Do you have anything? Or Ms. Posey, did you hear us say anything that you could contribute, or?
it pretty much mirrored some of the items here, and even looking at the question number one. In question number one, what are things there that could be looked at as to what we're doing, and look at some opportunities of what's legally required. From a district perspective, as Wake County Schools, we want to be the best. We want to provide a quality education, and the economics of what that does for the county as well. And so some of those topics are what came up. But there was just a lot of discussion, because it's a lot to think about in just 30 minutes.
And I think one of the big challenges, and I think both groups I've heard say this, are that it's one thing to identify the programs, but then as you evaluate the programs, so many of these things that were just mentioned, even back here at the table, are all things we as board members hear about from parents and teachers and even students about. We need better landscaping, we need better transportation, we need more in each of these areas. And so how we'll reconcile the funding we have with the needs and the public demands is going to be the challenge of this committee as we go forward. Ms. Caulfield?
I think it would be really helpful for us, and we did kind of talk about this a little bit, to have like two separate lists of like what is actually state required and paid for, and what we provide extra for Wake County. Because we do have a lot of options, we do have a lot of things that we offer families. So it's good for us to see where we're talking about the budget, and we can evaluate things there, but it's also good for the public to see, because then they know, look, Wake County provides all this stuff, and it's not provided by the state. This is what it costs to do that.
I think that's a good idea, and with that, what we're required to provide, but then isn't funded too, because then that's more money we have to go to the county for
Right.
in order to make, like, because we talk about like AIG and special education, where there's the state cap, and I mean, it's an option. You talk about what's not provided. Do we not serve those additional AIG students? Do we not serve those special education students?
ESL, like,
Right.
these are all strains on our
Yeah.
system.
They're all things that we want to and need to keep providing those services, but right now they're not being paid for, so, yeah, by the state, I mean, yeah. All right then, well, we are a few minutes over. I apologize to our chairman, but I will turn it over to him, and we can move into work session at the appropriate time. Thank you, everyone.